It is a great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Katherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist, a professor in the Department of Political Science, a director of the Climate Center, and an associate in the Public Health Program of the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. She's been a lead author on the last 3 national climate assessments, but the most important work she is doing is calling people to climate action. She relentlessly connects values and faith with the science. No one in the country is doing more to invite all people, regardless of faith, ideology, politics, geography, or life experiences, into finding solutions for climate change. She's building bridges, she's bringing hope, she's inspiring the change that science is calling us to embrace. Dr. Katherine Hayhoe.
You can probably hear me anyways. So I'm so glad to be with you here today, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an assumption. And the assumption I'm going to make is that we don't need to talk too much about the science. Now, if anybody does have any questions about the science, how do we know climate is changing? How do we know humans are responsible? What does it mean for us living here in Iowa? There's a lot of great resources that you can use, and on YouTube we actually have a series called Global Weirding, not warming, weirding, which is about 35 super short videos that answer a lot of common questions that people have. But I'm not going to speak to that today, and if you have questions about that, I would encourage you to check out Global Weirding, or also check out a really great website called skepticalscience.com that answers all of the top questions that people have about science. And if you want answers to those to share with other people, I would encourage you to write those down too. So Skeptical Science and Global Weirding were the 2 resources I recommend. But what I'm going to do today is I want to talk more about the most important thing that we can do who are already concerned about this issue, and some of the pitfalls and traps that we often fall into along our journey. So when it comes to the most important thing we can do, this was a question that confronted me early on. Until I moved to Texas, I was sort of a typical scientist, doing your research, presenting at conferences, publishing papers. And then I moved to Texas, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go because I had already figured out by then that there was a lot of people who didn't think that climate change was real. And I'd already figured out that a lot of those people probably live in Texas. And the reason we were moving is because the university wanted my husband, and I was the +1. So I was really not sure how it was going to go. But within about 2 months of arriving in Texas, I got my first invitation to speak to a women's group. They were very curious about climate change. They heard a lot of conflicting information. They weren't sure who to believe. So they thought, oh, well, if we have somebody at our local university, then maybe we should talk to them. So I got my very first invitation to speak to a group where not everybody was on board, but they were curious and they had questions. So I did the best that I could with the science, and then I listened very carefully to the questions they gave me, which were questions about, well, what about volcanoes, or how do you know that it's really happening? And so I went back and I looked up the answers to those, and then the next time I got invited, which was just a few weeks later, because somebody at that talk invited me to speak to their group, I answered those questions in my presentation, and then I listened very carefully to the questions I got next. You can't talk about a problem without telling people a solution to it. I mean, if somebody told you about a horrible problem, but there was nothing you could do about it, what would your response be? If there's nothing I could do, why worry about it? It's just needless anxiety. So I realized that it's actually really irresponsible to talk about a problem without talking about a solution. But I thought to myself, well, what am I supposed to tell people? Light bulbs? Sure. I mean, nothing wrong with that, right? Recycling, good idea. We all live very different lives, and so I started to share with people, well, the most effective thing we can do is probably to step on the carbon scales, to measure your carbon footprint, and then figure out where your carbon footprint comes from, because some people will say, oh, well, it's all commuting. And for some people it may be if they drive long distances every day on a regular basis in a relatively inefficient car. For other people, you might say, well, it's all our diet. We just eat way too much meat, and cutting meat out of our diet or going meat-free a couple of days a week would be the easiest way to reduce our carbon footprint. For me personally, it was travel. My travel is the biggest part of my carbon footprint. So I decided that I was going to start transitioning now I'm up to about 80% of my talks to virtual talks. So I give, on average, about 2 virtual talks a week, which is fantastic because you can give a lot more of them that way, and also there's hardly any carbon involved. And when I do travel, I only travel when I have multiple events in one place. So I was here in Ames and Cedar Falls, now Cedar Rapids, and Dubuque, doing multiple events in just 2.5 days. But then I realized, even if every single one of us reduce our carbon footprint as much as we can, and it's really difficult to reduce our carbon footprint to 0 unless we decide to live off the grid and grow our own vegetables and never travel anywhere. Even if we all reduce our footprint as much as we can, that wouldn't be enough to fix the problem. It wouldn't. Because we need system-wide change too. If you look at the carbon emissions that are the primary reason why climate is changing today, only 100 companies have produced 70% of emissions since the beginning of the industrial era. So all the personal choices in the world are not going to change that. We need system-wide change. So that was when I started to also look at public opinion data. Because I'm very interested in making sure that we meet people where we're at. If we're going to have a conversation, we want to make sure that that conversation is effective. So I started to look at the public opinion polling data that had just started to come out after I had started speaking to different groups. And as a scientist, I was concerned primarily about the fact that many people think that the science isn't real. And if we listen in the media, if we listen to news articles, no matter what we listen to, it seems like that's the biggest and most dangerous myth that we feel like the largest number of people have bought into, the idea that science is somehow optional. That I could say gravity isn't real and I can step off the cliff and somehow I'd be okay. Or I could say that I don't believe climate is changing and it won't be changing because I don't believe it is. This type of idea, the idea that facts are somehow optional or a matter of opinion, it's been around for a long time. There was a book called Anti-Intellectualism in America that was published in 1963. The idea that somehow our opinions are better than facts has been endemic in society for decades and for generations. So as a response, we often think, and we scientists are more guilty than anyone else in doing this, we often think, well, if they just knew the right information, they would change their minds, right? And that idea does work in some cases. So for example, if I asked you, well, what do you think dark matter is made out of? And either you said I had no idea, or you said, well, it's probably this. And then I said, well, actually, the latest science says that dark matter is made out of this. Most people would say, okay, right? I mean, you have no intrinsic objection to what dark matter is made out of, right? So when there's nothing particularly, when we have no strong identity or emotions attached to something, when we get more information on it, we're generally okay with it. But when we have a very strong identity or ideology or emotions attached to something, and somebody says, oh, no, 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 what do? We feel like that they're trying to take away something. It's almost like Linus with his blanket. You remember Charlie Brown? They're trying to take away something that's really important to us. And if somebody's trying to take away something that's important to you, what do? Do you say okay and hand it to them? Or do you push back? You hang on to that blanket even tighter. You're like, no, you can't take this away from me. This is really important. In fact, what studies have shown is the smarter we are, and the better educated we are, the better we are at going out and finding reasons to defend our pre-existing opinion than changing our mind. And we all do this, do not get me wrong. So just as an example, I feel very strongly that if the yogurt is past its expiration date, it is still okay to eat. My husband, who is another very intelligent person, he says not. So we have had some arguments where we each go out and we find peer-reviewed journal articles that show that you either can or cannot eat the yogurt. We've compromised on I eat it and he doesn't. But to my point, neither of us gave in on our opinion on the yogurt. We just looked for more information to show why we were correct about it. And yogurt is nothing, it is insignificant compared to the emotions we have attached to an issue like climate change today. So we often think that the biggest myth people have bought into, and the myth that we have to fight the hardest against, is the idea that the science isn't real, that I don't agree with the science. And so in order to combat that, we provide people with information. But again, what the social sciences showed is that the more we present people with information, the more they see it as we're trying to take their blanket away from them, we're trying to actually attack them personally, and the more they resist and the stronger they dig in. Okay, so this is the next resource to write down, the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. And if you just Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps, they'll pop right up. If you look at those, the first map says, you know, do you think that climate change is changing due to human activities? And the country's pretty sort of, probably, but not too strong, right? But then you say, is global warming happening? And the entire country is pretty much like, yes, that's happening. And then you say, do you think it's going to affect plants and animals and future generations? And people are like, oh, yes. And then you say, well, do you think it's going to affect people in developing countries and people in the United States? And people are like, yes. In fact, many more people say yes to that than say it's happening due to human activities. And then they ask this question. They say, do you think it will affect, and remember they've already asked, do you think it'll affect people in the US? Most people say yes. Do you think it will affect you? And all of a sudden, the whole map, which was orange means more than 50%, the whole map goes blue, which means less than 50%. All of a sudden, we think it will affect the person who literally is sitting next to us, not us. It's a bit magical thinking. So the biggest myth that the largest number of people have bought into is not that the science isn't real, it's that it doesn't affect us. And the map is blue even across areas where you would think everybody's convinced, like Florida. So why is this so important? Because even if we think it's real, but we don't think it affects us, then why would action be needed? See what I mean? It isn't that we don't think it's real, it's that we think it doesn't matter, so it slides way down our priority scale to the things that don't matter, like that closet under the stairs that we never look at until we move. And then we're horrified to find out what was actually in it. I've had that experience myself. Anybody else? Yes. So then, there's one more question that is even a darker blue, which means more people said no to it. And this relates directly back to what I was talking about before. The next question that they ask people, which pretty much everybody said no to, is this. Do you ever talk about it or hear anybody else talking about it? And the answer was no. So that is why, after more than 10 years of trying to answer the question for people of what's the most important thing we can do, after more than 10 years of this, I have concluded the single most important thing that every individual can do, every person, is talk about it. Because we are not talking about it. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever act or ask others to act too? But when we talk about it, I do not mean bringing out 10 feet of scientific reports and hitting people upside the head with them. Last night, I don't know if you follow me on social media, but last night I was really excited to announce something. I'm writing a new book, and the book is about how to have conversations about climate change. And I asked people to send me your stories about conversations that you've had. And one person responded and he said, I'm really looking forward to reading your book, but make sure you make it thick so I can use it to hit people over the head with. That sort of defeats the whole purpose. So I am not talking about dragging out all of the science that we've been doing since the 1850s, because that is how long we've known that digging up and burning fossil fuels produces heat-trapping gases that cause the planet to warm. Because people might say, well, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not really qualified or capable. No, that's not the most important thing to talk about, because that's not the greatest myth that we bought into. The two greatest myths we bought into are, first of all, the idea that it doesn't matter to us, and then second of all, the idea that I'm not the right type of person to care about the solutions. So I want to unpack those two topics for you to kind of give you some examples. So we often think, well, climate change matters to what? People agree it matters to plants and animals, it matters to polar bears. It matters to future generations, it matters to people who live on low-lying islands in the South Pacific. Can't really pronounce their names, but we know that they're flooding, right? But we think it doesn't matter to us. Well, water's a big part of it, right? Heavy rainfall, flooding, specific examples you can point to, people you know who've been harmed by the flooding. Also warmer temperatures, seasons shifting, pests and invasive species creeping northward, increased risk of heat in the summer. We're seeing a lot of changes right here, and we can talk about those changes. So that's the first most important thing to talk about, is how it matters to us in the places where we live. And then the second thing to talk about is why it matters to us who we already are. Now this one's a little kind of non-intuitive, but follow me here, because I think this is really the most important point. We think, well, of course you care if you're a scientist, right? Because you're a scientist, so you study this stuff. So of course you would care if you're a scientist. And then we think, well, if you're an environmentalist, of course you would care too. As if somehow people could float around in outer space without our planet. So by being an environmentalist, you care about the environment and nature, but you don't care about people. Doesn't quite make sense, but that's what people think. Well, I'm not an environmentalist. And then today, one of the biggest things people think is, well, I'm not a liberal. I'm not a Democrat. So I can't care about changing climate because that's only something that those people care about. How does the balance of power and wealth in this world lie in the hands of those who have every incentive to keep us addicted to fossil fuels as long as possible? So, the fifth resource on your list, if you're interested in digging more into this and finding out more about how did this become so politicized, where did the money come from, who did it go to, and what did they do with it to make it politicized, there is a fantastic book or movie, either one, called Merchants of Doubt. I bet a bunch of you have seen that. Did they have seen it? Yes, okay, yeah. Merchants of Doubt. And really, I recommend both the book and the movie because they're not quite the same thing. The book is more kind of unpacks and tracks all of the money and all of the PR and all of the smoke screens. And then the movie actually talks to some of these people who are promoting it, receiving the money and promoting the smoke screens. You can actually hear from their own voices how they think what they're doing is perfectly fine. And if you are Catholic, does that not mean that you should be agreeing with what the Pope says, mostly? And if you are a Christian of any type, does that not mean you should be agreeing with what the Bible says? Is that not what a Christian is? I once asked the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, named Leith Anderson, who's a pastor in Minnesota, who just retired recently. I asked him, what is your definition of evangelical? And he said, my definition is somebody who takes the Bible seriously. So then, we live in a world where, apparently, according to polls, half of the people who self-identify as evangelicals who voted for Trump don't even go to church. And a large number of the people who I interact with on a nearly daily basis, especially through social media and through email and things like that, a large number of them say things to me that sound religiously, but when you go to the Bible, it's exactly 180 degrees. So let me give you an example. The most common argument I hear is, well, God's in control, so it's all going to work out anyways. But in Genesis 1, which is the first chapter in the Bible, so if you're beginning at the beginning, you get to this on the first page. In Genesis 1, it says, God gave humans responsibility, or in the old translation, dominion, over every living thing on this planet. Who? Us. Humans. God gave it to us. So if we are the ones with the responsibility, then clearly we are the ones who have been given the ability to make decisions. And then all the way at the end of the Bible in Revelation, it actually says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. So interestingly, our episode, our Global Weirding episode on what does the Bible say about climate change is our most watched episode. Isn't that interesting? It is not a faith-based series, it's a PDF series, but that's the one everybody wants to watch. Then there's people who say, the second most common argument is, well, the world's going to end anyway, so why does it matter, right? And people being people, it turns out that people were saying exactly that same thing back when the New Testament was being written. Yeah, not much changes. And there were specifically people who were living in the Greek city of Thessalonica, and the Apostle Paul wrote to them. And basically, in so many words, said, get a job. But they're like, oh, well, Christ is returning in a moment, so we'll just kind of sit back and wait. It's like, get a job, care for the widows, care for the orphans, care for the poor. You don't know the day or the time, so that doesn't mean you're just supposed to fold your hands and say, Maranatha. It means that you're supposed to do what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be walking in the good works that are prepared for you in advance. So, the first greatest myth again is that we don't think it matters to us, and the second greatest myth is we don't think we're the right type of person to care. But when you start digging into what conservatives really believe, what Christians really believe, it turns out that we're the exact person to care. In fact, when we put those two myths together in terms of how it affects us and who we believe ourselves to be, it turns out that we might even already care, we just haven't connected the dots or recognized it yet. And this is a really important perspective for us to take as we have these conversations with people. Because if we approach a conversation with the perspective of believing in the myths, believing that more information is going to change people's minds, believing that it matters to things that matter to me, but not them, like the polar bear or future generations, they do matter to me, they matter to a lot of people. But if we approach somebody else thinking, okay, well, you don't care about the things I care about, what's the subtext to that attitude? If I care about something and you don't care about something, and I think you should care about it, the subtext is you're not a good person, right? Because you don't care about these things. That's the subtext. And believe me, we're really good at picking up on that, right? And then, when we assume furthermore that who they are, their core identity, which could be either a farmer or a grower or a producer, it could be either Republican, it could be either Christian, it could be either Catholic, it could be either Democrat. When we assume that their identity is incompatible and inconsistent with understanding that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and we need to act now, we're going even further to tell them that what their identity is wrong, and they have to change who they fundamentally are. And to be perfectly honest, do you want to change who you fundamentally are? No. That's a big role of us as parents, is to help our children develop an identity. But by the time you're our age, you don't want somebody coming along and telling you what your new identity is. So, especially if you don't really agree with it. So I have a lot of people talk to me, and in recent days, I have had people say things to me like, why can't I find your email address online? And I say, well, I have a website, and everybody can email me through my website. And they say, well, I want your email address. I said, why? I said, to start a dialogue with you. And I said, what about it? And they said, to educate. So what was my reaction to that? What would be your reaction to that? See, I'm not going to say it, I think you know, right? So what if we're the person doing that to somebody else? What's their reaction going to be? I don't really want to be educated by you. Thank you very much, right? And then, what if somebody says to you, well, you don't understand what's important. Here's what's really important. What would your reaction be? I do understand what's important. Thank you very much, right? And then even worse, and I just had this experience actually on social media this morning. Even worse, when somebody says to you, who you are is foolish and superstitious, misguided and wrong. Well, how would you react to somebody who says something like that to you? Would you be willing to listen to what they had to say after that? Probably not so much, right? Now these are a little tiny bit exaggerated, so you can really, not exaggerate to what people said to me, that's actually what I said. But they're situations that are a little bit more in bold as opposed to just regular text. But we have all been guilty of being on the other side of that. Because even if we use words that don't say those things, if our attitude behind those words is, you do not have the right values, you are not the right person, I will fix you. If that is our attitude behind the conversation we have, it's not going to go anywhere. But here's the good news. The good news is this. I have become firmly convinced that with just a very few number of exceptions, every single one of us is already the perfect person to care. Now, there's a few people in this world who care nothing for anyone else. And with those people, I think, maybe they're not the perfect person to care. But those people are a lot fewer and far between than we think. Why? Because climate change is not just a science issue. Of course it is a science issue, but it's not just. Climate change is not just an environmental issue either. Why do we care about changing climate? We care about it because it affects our health. Who doesn't care about our health, right? You can have all the money in the world, but if you do not have your health, you have nothing. It affects our families. It affects our communities. It affects our food and our water, and every human needs food and water. It affects our security and our safety. It affects the economy. It affects our bank accounts through increasing insurance rates and costs. It affects the poorest people in the world more than anyone else. It exacerbates hunger and poverty and disease and lack of access to clean water. It even exacerbates political instability in regions and states where they're already failing, and climate change can be like the final straw on the camel's back that pushes it over the edge. Climate change affects almost every single aspect of human life on this planet. Through having conversations with people, I have learned that climate change affects the ability of IT to provide services. Climate change affects emergency response because often they staff by the thermometer. Climate change affects our mental health. Climate change affects our physical health. Climate change affects everything. So to care about a changing climate, we already are the perfect person to care, but nobody has helped us to connect the dots between who we already are and why we actually already care, and there's even climate actions that we would support if we knew about them. Now, think about this attitude for a while. If somebody comes to you and expresses to you through their words and their attitude, because again, attitude, I hope you're understanding me here, attitude is just as important, if not more than words. If somebody comes to you and expresses through their attitude and their words to you that you're a great person, that you have good values, that who you are, that what you've built your identity on is a good thing. If someone respects you, if someone honors you, if someone appreciates you, and then someone says to you, because of who you are, which is a great person who I respect and appreciate, because of who you are, you would already care about this if you knew. And let me share with you why I care because of much the same reason why you care. It's something natural for us to care about. So understanding that who we already are is the perfect person to care was a huge breakthrough for me in talking about it, because it shifted completely, not only the content, but the attitude of how I have these conversations. But then I learned one more thing, which I think is even more fascinating. And that is that not only do we want to be respected for who we are and acknowledged for who we are, but we actually crave opportunities to be even more of who we are. So if there's something that, and I'll just give you a classic example, and this sounds, small and silly, but I'm from Ontario, Canada, and our family, so in Canada, having a cottage is a big thing. We call them cottages if they have running water inside. They're a cabin if they don't. Just FYI. So we did have running water in ours. It was from the 1920s because the cottage was built in 1908. We actually had a clawfoot bathtub that was the original bathtub, and that was it, no shower. But our family has been cottaging in this area since my great-grandparents took their honeymoon there in the early 1900s. And our family has cottages all around this bay on a certain lake, and now I have third cousins and fourth cousins who are all on that bay. And it's just really fun to be up there and to interact with and to actually know your third and your fourth cousins. I mean, my son now, some of his friends are his fourth cousins, and that's pretty amazing. So when I was in a store, I happened to see a t-shirt down in Toronto that had the name of the lake on it. And I was like, I have to have that t-shirt. I'm gonna buy a few extras because I know my sister and my cousin will want those too. Why? Because that was part of our identity. So having a t-shirt that actually had the name of the lake on it made us even more of what we wanted to be, right? Now that's a very trivial example. But my point is, we want our identity that we've decided is important to us in this part of our life, we want that identity to be reinforced even further. And so here's the really interesting thing when it comes to acting on climate. And this is something that I learned from George Marshall, so here's resource number 6. George Marshall is a Brit. He runs an organization called Climate Outreach, which does fantastic work on best practices on communicating on climate change. And he wrote a really good book called Don't Even Think About It, How Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. It's super short little chapters, very funny stories. Part of what he did in writing the book was he toured megachurches in the US to kind of look at how they got people motivated to act. So Don't Even Think About It, How Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change by George Marshall. Something that George said has stuck with me because it resonates right into it, ties right into this. What he said was, again, it isn't only that we are already the perfect person to care, it's that acting on climate will make us even more of who we already are. And that's when you get people to act. When they understand that not only is climate action not opposed to who they are, because so often the solutions that we're told about, they sound opposed to who we are. So what solutions do we hear about that are opposed? Well, it's going to ruin the economy to fix climate change. Or the government's going to be telling us how long showers we can take and nobody's going to be able to drive a truck. Or the latest myth making the round in conservative circles is that the only solution to climate change is abortion. I am not joking, that is the latest myth. And so anybody who's pro-life immediately, well, I can't get on board with climate solutions because that's the only solution. So first of all, are those the only solutions? Of course not. We're talking about preserving life. We're talking about educating women and girls is one of the top solutions from Project Drawdown. Why? Because it reduces infant mortality rates so people don't have to have so many children because their children last longer and better lives. Live longer, I should say. So not only is it important to recognize that climate action is not inconsistent with who we are, incompatible with who we are, that's taking us from a negative to a 0. We want to go from a 0 to a positive. So from a negative to a 0 is it's not inconsistent with who we are, but from the 0 to a positive is it makes us even more of who we are by acting on climate. It enhances our identity. It shows that we take being a conservative even more seriously. That we take being a Christian even more seriously. That we take being a good steward of our land as a farmer or a grower even more seriously. That we are a better farmer, that we're a better Christian, that we're a better conservative, that we're a better human, we're a better parent, we're a better citizen of Iowa. We're a better person because we're acting on climate. Does that make sense? Well, let me give you a specific example to show you what I mean. So, skeptical science, second resource on your list, is the brainchild of a man called John Cook. John Cook is a scientist, and he has a father. And every time he went home, his father would be like, well, John, there's more polar bears now than there ever has been. And he'd be like, well, they used to hunt polar bears, but then they stopped hunting them, so the populations grew a bit, but now they're declining. And then the next time he'd be home, his dad would be like, well, John, I heard the ice caps on Mars are melting. So, John, through digging into all of these issues, he builds this website that becomes the premier website in the entire world that answers more than 200 but what about questions about climate science with detailed answers that link directly to the original science. He goes back to school and he does a PhD in social science to understand denialism. He becomes one of the foremost experts in the world in debunking sciencey related myths. And do you think it changes his father's mind? Didn't. But then, in the area where his father lived, and this just happened a couple of years ago, in the area where his father lived in Australia, the government offered a rebate on solar panels. Now, what is his father's identity? I have not met his father, so I'm extrapolating here. But his father's identity, from what I have picked up, is that of a shrewd, smart, fiscal conservative. His father's identity is somebody who does not spend money with a spade, somebody who's careful with their money, somebody who is truly conservative, somebody who's smart, somebody who would enjoy sticking it to the government if given the chance. So here you are, he's offered this rebate, he calculates the numbers, he realizes, wow, I can really take advantage of this. He installs the solar panels, he saves so much money, he goes around boasting to everybody knows about how much money he's saving. And now when John shows up for dinner, he's not being asked about polar bears, he's being shown the saving sheets from the solar panels. So what happened? Those solar panels reinforced his father's identity. It made him an even smarter and shrewder fiscal conservative than he already was, right? And so after about a year, his dad says to John, he says, well, John, he says, you know, you might be right about that whole global warming thing. But I'm doing my part. I have my solar panels. So in other words, instead of being the bad person who's opposing the solutions, I am now the good person who's part of the solutions, so I can afford to acknowledge the reality of the problem because now there's a solution I can accept. Because 99, in fact, I would even go further and say 99.9% of the time, when you have a conversation with somebody that begins with it's just a natural cycle, within a minute or two, that conversation will take a 90-degree turn into the EPA wants to take away my truck, or the government wants to destroy our economy, or what about China? They're going to take over the world if we let them. Never mind that China has more wind and solar energy than anyone else. That usually doesn't factor into the conversation. So our real problem is solution aversion. We don't think there's solutions compatible or consistent with who we are. So what are we doing when we have conversations with people? We are talking about how it matters to us in the places where we live, and we are talking about solutions that are consistent and compatible with who they already are, so they can get on board with the solution, because once they're on board with the solution, the sciencey and religious-y arguments sort of evaporate. And what I really see my role as doing is, in the book of James, there's a verse in the Bible that talks about how you're like a man who looked in a mirror and then went away and forgot what he looks like. So when I talk to people, I've started to feel as if I'm holding up a mirror. And I'm just holding up that mirror to remind people of who they already are. Because we've lost our way, we've forgotten who we are. Whoever it is that we've decided that we are. We're not acting consistent with who we are. And again, not every single human, but most of us already have the values we need to care about a changing climate. We just haven't connected the dots. So when you have that conversation, helping someone connect the dots to a place that they will eventually want to be, an even more genuine version of who they are. Helping somebody connect the dots is a lot easier than telling somebody who you are is inadequate, who you are is wrong, who you are is bad, you have to change. Those conversations rarely end well. But having a conversation that takes someone to a place where they want to be, that's where the conversation can end well. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. I want to encourage you to have those conversations about things that matter, connecting to people's values. And I want to close with a brief why these conversations matter. So my TED Talk, which talks about how talking about climate change is the most important thing that any individual person can do. And when I say talk, I don't necessarily mean you have to use your mouth, though it helps. You can use your hands. You can do it virtually too. But engaging with another human being and discussing why this issue matters and what we can do to fix it, that was what I think is the most important thing. And so my TED Talk came out this past December, so not even a year ago, 10 months ago. And then in May, I was in the UK for one of my bundles where I do a lot of different speaking engagements in the same area. And I was giving a talk that afternoon at the London School of Economics. After my talk, an older man came up to me who was a community member who had taken the train into London from the town he lived, which has about 160,000 people. He had taken the train in specifically to hear my talk, and afterwards he came up to me and he said, "I saw your TED Talk, and I decided that we needed to have conversations. So I've been having conversations ever since I watched your talk. And I've been writing down all the conversations that I've had and the people I've talked to have had with other people. Would you like to see the list?" I said, "Yeah, that's awesome." So he reaches in, he pulls out his list, and I was expecting, 70 or 80 people. He pulls out a stack of paper with 10,000 names on it. They had had 10,000 conversations from December through May in his town of 160,000 people. And as a result, he said that week their city council had just voted to declare a climate emergency because of the conversations. So too often we're trying to act before people understand why it matters. And too often we're trying to force people to understand why it matters before we've even had the conversation with them. So sometimes we really should have had it backwards. But talking is acting. So that kind of closes the loop, right? Talking is acting. So having that conversation about why it matters to us and what we can do that resonates with who we are, with our identity, with who we believe ourselves to be, is the single most important thing that any one of us can do.